Well, always good to be with our friend Pat Toomey, and now I want to welcome to PLC 2020 our friend State Representative Brian Cutler from Lancaster County, the Speaker of the House. Brian, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
And so, now that you have ascended to the top job, I know that this is still somewhat new, having taken that post earlier in the year, and just want to give our friends at PLC and those watching online and through PCN, tell them a little bit about you and who is the man from Peach Bottom?
Well, certainly. Obviously this year's been very different. I think we're all very anxious for 2020 to roll over on the calendar books and get to 2021. But in terms of how we kind of ended up here, I've been in the House for 7 terms. This term at the beginning, I was the majority leader. Prior to that, for 2 terms, I was the whip, so a total of 4 years. And then I spent 4 terms as rank and file. I originally started as an x-ray tech and then went and had an undergrad degree in hospital administration and then went to law school for healthcare law. Had intended to return to the healthcare world at that point, but got frustrated with state government and decided to run for office. And so literally my last week in law school, I won the primary on Tuesday. I graduated on Saturday. And then, ironically, I was in this very room to take my bar exam a couple months later. So it's not all fond memories being there.
Yes, I was going to say we're going to try to help to balance the scales on that with a good experience here at PLC. But as you say, Brian, the 2020 has been and continues to be an extremely strange and destabilizing year, and it's not only the pandemic itself, but also the way that that our society, the federal government, and our respective state governments have responded to the crisis. And I would argue that that in Pennsylvania, that Governor Tom Wolf's actions have made our situation much more complicated and much worse than they needed to be. His blanket order closing all businesses, his failure to adopt the federal standards under the Department of Homeland Security, and the waiver process that was a complete black box. Nobody could figure out how that worked. All of these things have compounded a bad situation. And the thing that I find most troubling is his lack of interest and his lack of willingness to interact with the stakeholders, including the General Assembly.
Yeah, I think that there's actually several crises right now. Everyone's very familiar with the healthcare one in terms of the pandemic and what the impact was, especially initially on to the healthcare system. And in the early days, our chamber came in. At that point, I was still leader, and Speaker Torzai and our leadership team, we put together a plan. And we put together a plan that would allow us to continue operations even under quarantine circumstances. And we were one of the first chambers in the country to adopt those rules. Ended up answering a lot of questions from other chambers from across the country in terms of, well, how does this work? How do you do remote voting? And it's worked fairly well. And we worked through that. Early on, there was a lot of agreement in terms of stockpiling PPE and helping our health systems, working with the educational system to give them some flexibility to continue to educate our students. And then we had to update the labor laws to be consistent with the federal law. All of those passed either unanimously or near unanimously very early on. But then we kind of got into the world that you're referring to in terms of the closure orders and the inconsistencies that we saw across the businesses, which actually created the second crisis that we're dealing with right now, which is really an economic and financial one.
Yes.
And that certainly has impacted individuals. It's impacted businesses. I recently read that 60 to 70% of the restaurants that are currently closed are likely to not reopen. And it's because of some of the rules and the impositions of the regulations by government that have put them in that position. One of the reasons I decided to run for office was I was tired of government trying to run an industry, in my case healthcare, that they didn't understand. And they would ask for things or duplicate things that would ultimately take us away from our core mission, which was serving patients.
Right.
This, unfortunately, is no different. When you look at the business closure orders and the occupancy things, we could be in this room right here, and if we called it a casino, you could be at 50% capacity. If you call it a restaurant, up until recently, it was 25% capacity, but if it's a nightclub, it's 0. And yet it's the same square footage, it's the same layout. I think that there needed to be some common sense applied to what that looked like and what that meant in terms of availability of space, as well as allowing individuals to be responsible, just as we see here today with the signs and the hand washing stations and the masks as people move about. I think all of that is workable. And quite frankly, we're going to have to find solutions.
Right.
Because the current process, which resulted in inconsistent rulings, ultimately ruled unconstitutional by a Western District United States court, because, as Judge Stickman said, these aren't fair weather freedoms. They persist even through a pandemic, and that's really what's put us here. There's been some inconsistencies where you would have big box stores that were allowed to be open, but small mom and pops couldn't do curbside pickup, while at the same time state stores could. What that has meant has been economic hardship for all these small business owners, because they don't have the same deep pockets that big business does in terms of weathering this storm.
Correct.
And then the other component, obviously, is tax collections. We're probably going to be off somewhere between $4 and $5 billion in revenue collections on a budget of $34 billion. And that's going to cause some issues. We're going to be working on that between now and the end of session. But then the other one that I think is unfortunately a very strong undercurrent, in addition to the health problems, in addition to the financial problems, is really one of mental health. When you look at what's happened with individuals not going to school, you've got students who are trapped with their abusers. They might not have access to food security, and they're not getting the intervention services or the counseling services that they need. My biggest fear is when we get on the other side of this, that we will hear this previously untold story of individuals who have suffered mental health issues, they've suffered with hunger, and they've suffered with counseling problems that were either missed or undiagnosed or delayed diagnosis because of all of these other orders that have been layered on to prevent access.
Yeah, and I think that the, again, it's a fundamental truth that there are trade-offs to everything. And the failure of Governor Wolf, Secretary Levine, to recognize any of those trade-offs has made this whole crisis situation so much worse. That, when you tell the hospitals to stop all non-emergency treatments, that you have people who start missing out on exams, on cancer screenings, and so you're sowing the seeds of long-term, really consequential, negative health outcomes for those people who didn't get screened, didn't get treated, didn't get preventative care, and again, that's, I would argue, it's partly why our whole American system of representative self-government has the push and pull of a separation of powers and checks and balances. And because in Pennsylvania that the governor has such sweeping emergency powers under the disaster declaration, and that the courts have disengaged the safeguards on that the lack of accountability on the governor has made this situation much worse.
Well, I think you really hit on something that I tried to hit on during floor debate, but I think that the citizens really need to understand. Under the court's interpretation of the law, and I personally don't think they got it right, I think that our filing and the way we advocated was correct. They were looking at this as a legislative process, which means both chambers goes to the governor for signature, whereas this was exercising authority under the statute that was already written.
Yes.
And under their construct, what is needed to overturn an emergency declaration by the governor is 1/3 of one body plus one.
Yeah.
So in our case, it would be 17 state senators, and the governor could determine everything. I don't believe that was consistent with the idea of checks and balances, and I think they've been thrown all askew during this crisis here in the Commonwealth. I also think that it's inconsistent with the statute as it's written. And I think that that's something that we're going to have to correct. It'll probably have to wait until after we get out of this current crisis, because I think the governor would likely be reluctant to change the current law given the fact that the court has backed up his position.
Right.
But it's something that I think we have to do for our Commonwealth's sake and for the sake of freedom, because it's inconsistent with the principles found elsewhere in the documents. And I think that we've really seen stripped bare some of the problems when you don't have the separation of powers acting in the way that it should. We've got a court right now that really is backing up some of the partisan positions of the governor, and it's really unfortunate.
And and again, there are long-term, long-term concerns, liberty concerns, core liberty concerns regarding this, but there are also, short-term, immediate consequences. As you said, the General Assembly passed a stopgap state budget. You did full funding for education, but for everything else, it was only a 5-month budget. So, when you come back in October, November to try to finish the state budget for the remainder of the fiscal year, you're looking at that huge shortfall, and that shortfall is going to get worse between now and then, depending on the rate of business closure. And so again, these are reasons why we need the governor to change his approach so that more of Pennsylvania's businesses survive this crisis. That ultimately there's no replacement to these businesses of income earned by satisfying customers. And to the extent that businesses can be open safely, we need them to be open so that they have that lifeline of revenue, so that more of them survive, so that more of them will be around in November and afterwards to be able to pay into the public coffers to help balance the budget.
Well, I think you really hit on the component that we hit consistently during floor debate. Many of the opening bills that we did and many of the approaches that we took was simply saying, for those who want to do so and can safely do so,
right,
may engage in this activity.
Right.
Whereas the current construct and the current orders, unfortunately, is all of this kind of activity must stop. And I just think that's a different approach than what I think our founders likely anticipated in terms of governmental powers. And that's one of the reasons why I think it's had strong bipartisan support. Every one of our opener bills, as we worked on, and I'll give you a good example. I referenced, and nothing against Home Depot or Lowe's. I personally frequent both,
yes,
as needed. But they were allowed to remain open, and yet in our case, we have garden centers in Lancaster County. It was planting season. And one of the problems was you could buy garden plants at grocery stores if they had them as an add-on, or you could buy them at Home Depot or Lowe's, or you could buy flowers. But yet garden centers and nurseries that specialized in the sale of that weren't permitted to be open because they weren't in a certain category or a certain description. And that to me was a place where the common sense really disconnected from the policy. Because one, many of the garden centers or the roadside stands that I would visit in my own area and in the 100th district where I live and around Peach Bottom, you're only going to be one or two people at any given time there.
Right.
Whereas, very rarely, and especially during the pandemic, because the larger box stores were the only places open, they were always crowded.
Yeah.
And I just think it was a disconnect. If you can engage in safe shopping in one place, it should have been allowed in another. And I also think, the food policy is really something that early on was very concerning. And, we did speak to the governor, and he did make some changes and some alterations to the orders early on, because I'm not sure that the average person really understands what the food supply chain looks like. Mm-hmm. Prior to the pandemic, more than half of the food was consumed outside of the home. So that meant it was in institutional size canisters, bags, whatever. It's not the small soup cans that you or I would buy, right, to put in our pantries. It was the large number 10
cafeterias.
Cans and the cafeterias and the restaurant style. And that's not something that could be switched easily. And we've seen it in the meat processing plants, which obviously are close conditions. That's why we ran a bill that dealt with those work conditions and providing PPE, because we recognize the critical nature that they played in our food infrastructure. And I think that those opportunities where we were able to work together, I think we were extremely successful. I think that we've continued, though, obviously, to disagree on how to safely reopen different components. Because, look, I think even if we opened all of the economy right now and we said, let's go ahead and open it, and I think this is true even if there were a vaccine, not everybody would return to daily activity as, right, as they saw previously, because they would individually make those decisions and say, like we saw now that non-emergent surgeries are now allowed. I have a friend of mine, he said, you know what, I don't know that I necessarily need my knee replaced right now. Maybe I'll wait a couple weeks and see how this is going. And I think that that kind of judgment and that kind of personal decision-making is just fundamental to our society.
Well, and I could possibly agree more. And I also wanted to specifically thank you for continuing to move the bills. That I know that oftentimes in the legislative process that there's no interest in moving something that may be headed for a veto. But because these issues are so critical and because the well-being of Pennsylvania, our economy, the ability of our families to take care of themselves, is paramount that you and the Senate leaders have been moving these pieces of legislation to reopen the economy. As you say, that they've received really strong bipartisan support. And even though the governor has continued to veto them, I think that this is a clarifying exercise. And I think also that, it communicates to the people of Pennsylvania going into the November election.
I think that in terms of what was vetoed, and I think we've got a record number of vetoes, unfortunately, during this cycle, but we've also got a record number of bills that were passed and signed into law, and some of which were repealing bills and getting rid of outdated laws. So there was lots of things to celebrate in terms of success. But the frustrating part has been the vetoes because they have had strong bipartisan support. Some of them have even had veto-proof numbers upon their original passage. And I understand party politics and the desire to back up your governor. But ultimately, to your point, we answer to the people back home in the district. And we've had bills that dealt with business reopenings. We've had bills that dealt with school issues. Most recently, the PIAA sports bill,
yes,
which had overwhelming support. I think it had 150 or 149 votes when it passed the House originally. And they peeled off a large number of those for the veto override. And that, interestingly, was the issue that I heard the most about from parents. It wasn't when school was closed down at the end of last year. And I'm a big believer in education being the great equalizer.
Yes.
But the number one traffic item really was related to sports and extracurricular activities for students. And I think it showed in the vote total in terms of all of the opening bills. That was the one that had the highest number, bipartisan support. Again, we did try a veto override last week. We fell about half a dozen, 4 or 5, maybe 5 votes short on the final tally. So it was unfortunate because I think that's something that the people felt very strongly about. And I'm not sure that individuals necessarily represented the way that they wanted them to. So I'm sure that their phones have been ringing since then.
So how do you feel about, with what you have seen interacting with the members of your caucus and traveling the Commonwealth, how would you describe the current political mood?
Well, I think the current political mood, in a lot of ways, it's somewhat difficult to kind of capture just because there's so little interaction that we would normally have in an election year. There's no, there's not the number of large rallies. There's not, get out the vote efforts, things like that. So it's hard to see that. I will tell you as leader and now as speaker, I've put tens of thousands of miles on my car going across the Commonwealth, speaking at different events or, speaking to editorial boards or chambers. And I'm seeing a lot of enthusiasm, I think, for our candidates from the top of the ticket the whole way down. And I think that will play out through Election Day because at the end of the day, I think individuals really care about a couple core things. I think that economic security and health, safety, and welfare is one of them. Now, we may disagree right now in terms of the legislature and the governor in terms of how much of each one of those, or which one outweighs the other. The governor, I think he is well-intentioned, but he's clearly taken a position on the health issues that we need to rapidly approach zero. It went from flattening the curve and not overwhelming hospitals to now we need to work on a vaccine and limit the total number of cases. I personally think it needs to be more of a balance between both the health security and the economic security that comes with being able to provide for our families. Because sadly, during this crisis, we've seen one of the biggest failures of government where they told individuals they could not go to work and then they failed to deliver the unemployment benefits that they were owed. And I still have individuals in the district who have yet to receive one payment, while at the same time they're being told by the very same government who's not paying them, I'm sorry, you can't go back to work yet. That is just inconceivable to me and unacceptable.
Yes, sir. Absolutely. So, I mean, it's hard to speculate again. So much will be determined, with the November election as to, what the next 2 years are going to look like in Harrisburg. But I would just ask you, Mr. Speaker, what are some of the goals that you want to work towards over the horizon? What are some of the near-term things that you'd like to make progress on?
Well, I think in a lot of ways it's consistent with how we opened the session. We understand that given the current crisis, I don't think you're going to tax your way out of it. I don't think you're going to completely cut your way out of it. I think the only way that's going to be successful is to grow your way out of it. And when you go back to the very first package of bills that we passed that had strong bipartisan support, it dealt with education and workforce development. And having a trained workforce, I think we're blessed in terms of living here in the Commonwealth. I think we've got some of the best work ethic in the country. I think we are blessed with natural resources and close proximity to a lot of markets. Mm-hmm. Those are all reasons for people to be here. You layer on the infrastructure and the access to cheap energy and electricity, everybody should be wanting to come to the Commonwealth. And our goal is to continue to make that our vision and really, to borrow a statement from Majority Leader, make us the envy of the East and have individuals come here. And I think that vision will continue. If you look back through all of the bills that we've passed, including some of the reopeners and into the pandemic, it's been consistent. We want to provide economic opportunity for our citizens. We want to grow our population, and we want to grow our economy.
Outstanding. Well, we appreciate your leadership, Mr. Speaker, and we especially appreciate you taking time to be here with us at Virtual PLC 2020.
Happy to do it.